Welcome to ThinkTech. Welcome to ThinkTech Asia here on Monday afternoon. I'm here with Mike Sacharski. He's the leader of PEC International. That stands for Pacific Enterprise Capital. And he's a China hand for many years. And today we're going to talk about China's reaction to Middle East terrorism. And I guess that means ISIS. It means the whole new concept of an Islamic State and the dissolution of borders, if you will, and all the really incredible things that have been happening over the past year or two. So, Mike, you have had personal experience in your travels in China with this kind of thing, with terrorism in China, and you've seen it happen and seen the Chinese government react.
Yeah, Jay, first of all, thanks for inviting me on Monday afternoon.
Thanks for coming on Monday afternoon.
And it's always good to start off the week, with something really interesting to talk about and to do. This issue about China and China's response to Mideast terrorism has its roots really some 2,500 years ago. When the area now known as Xinjiang, which is inhabited by almost 50% now, near 50% Uyghurs, which are Sunni Muslims, began to emerge as a political unit. And over that 2,500 years, it was that, and of course, Xinjiang is located in the far west of China. It's the 8th largest state subdivision in the world, and it's a beautiful province. It goes everywhere. It goes the range from desert. It has actually an area called the Turpan Depression, which is 150 meters under sea level, to butting up against the Himalayas and the Pamir Mountains, the Hindu Kush. Then wraps around, and the northern border faces Mongolia, the Mongolian steppes, and then you kind of come around and face east, and now you're looking toward China proper, and you're looking at the lowlands of the Himalayas as they spill down into central China.
God, what an interesting place. How did the Uyghurs get there? They must have come from.
Well, they migrated. It's one of these, and by the way, it's a very diverse area because you've got alpine mountains. You think you're in Switzerland
really?
Because they've got pine-covered alpine-type mountains, mountain lakes, pristine mountain lakes that are up in the mountains, and then, like I say, you go down into the floor. And you've got grasslands, you've got desert. China also has their nuclear testing facility at Lap Nor, which is in Xinjiang province. Mm-hmm. So Xinjiang province is right at the crossroads of Central Asia. And so where did the Uyghurs come from? Where did the Muslims come from? They came from centuries of migration. The Silk Road passes across Xinjiang province. India, the Buddhist and Hindu of Mohenjo-Daro, and India and so on, they came up through that area to trade with eastern China. So it was the interstate of its time, and as trade and commerce went across, Marco Polo came across as well, as trade and commerce came across this area, then so did the Turkic Uyghurs. The Uyghurs ethnically and racially are Turks. And so they inhabited that area, and of course they were swept back and forth by invading Mongols, invading raiders from India. I think even some of the Alexander the Great kind of sped through there.
Back and a long way away.
And so it was a real, as I say, crossroads. Well, now today, that's why we go back some 2,500 years ago. And more recently, what's happened is that you've got Xinjiang proper, most of Xinjiang, but then up in the northeast of Xinjiang, in 1944, 1949, a group of Uyghurs formed a republic, and they were sponsored by the Soviet Union. The Soviets helped them form that republic. They thought of themselves as being an independent republic. After World War II and in the post-war years, that area of Xinjiang that belonged to the Kuomintang, when the Kuomintang gave way to the communists and the People's Republic of China, they claimed that portion of Xinjiang that had belonged to the Kuomintang, and they also claimed that area that had been made into a small republic up in the northwest. And so what's happened since the 1950s is that an area at that time that was predominantly inhabited by these Sunni Muslim Uyghurs, eventually China began to assign and send Han Chinese, young Han Chinese who had just come out of college or trade school. In those days, you were assigned by the government, and they assigned Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang to help not only develop Xinjiang, but breed and create more Han Chinese. And
to be balanced out.
And balance out the
population.
Uyghur population and so forth. And so the history of Xinjiang is all kind of bundled up into what we have had for the last 30 years that I've been in China. And that is number one, a resentment by the Uyghurs because they have been treated as second-class citizens, generally speaking, even though China has tried with some sort of degree of largesse to bring them into the system. Still, there is the inequality with Han, the history of inequality with Han. And
by the way, Mike, are they practicing Muslims? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Just as you would find in other places.
Absolutely, yes.
And they wear the Muslim garb?
No, well, they wear the Turkic, more of a, I don't want to call it ethnic dress. I was going to say costume, but it's an ethnic dress. And if you think of the Turkic ethnic dress of kind of a Turkish, Greek clothing and headwear.
And are they Chinese at all, or are they from the Middle East?
No, they are Turkic. They're Middle East.
They never intermarried with the Chinese there?
Generally speaking, no. And so at any rate, there have been various movements among the Uyghurs and outside support for the Uyghurs to resist Chinese, what they consider occupation of Uyghur homeland. And the Uyghurs, of course, are looking west toward their Turkic homeland. They want to see a reunification, if you will, not necessarily political as much as ethnic and so forth with West. They're not looking east. And what's interesting about China, while we're kind of getting into the introduction of this, is that Islam has spread throughout the rest of China. And now almost 2% of China is Muslim, and growing to some extent. So you've got, and these Muslims are now distributed all over China. They're not concentrated in the east. Excuse me, in the west, in Xinjiang.
So they're not from Xinjiang.
No, the Muslims I'm talking about now are Han Chinese who have embraced Islam, and they are now all over China. I hired back almost 15 years ago now. I hired a young lady in Beijing to work in my office, and after about 6 months, her colleague, who was also in our office, came to me and said, "Oh, so-and-so is so happy to be working here," and sort of effusively. And I thought, that was, happiness is happiness. But I said, well, what's the, and she said, well, she's Muslim. And generally, Chinese companies won't hire her so she found a place. Well, I never knew she was, I never asked her if she was Muslim or not. But it speaks to sometimes the issues that Muslims have in China. But it's even more pronounced, I think, the issues of equality or issues of acceptance between the Turkic Uyghurs and the rest of China. So there's been this, long before 9/11, there's been a campaign by certain groups of Uyghurs, not all Uyghurs, but certain more radicalized Uyghurs, I suppose. I had an assignment to the Xinjiang State Broadcast Bureau, which is part of the propaganda ministry, China's propaganda ministry. And the company I was with, we were putting in the first digital audio satellite network in Asia. And the ministry in Beijing, I think about 600 units, as I recall, to distribute all over Xinjiang so they could broadcast out Han programming and so forth. And so I had to go to the Broadcast Bureau. 2 days before I got there, it was attacked by Uyghurs, and they hadn't had time to clean it up. So there was from the gunfire, some light automatic gunfire.
Serious attack then.
A serious attack, and so there was still rubble around from that. Plus, it was an antenna farm because it's the provincial broadcast. So they had about maybe 4 or 5 antennas. The largest one maybe 7.5 meters, and they had all been warped into Alice in Wonderland sort of mushroom shapes from the fire of the Molotov cocktails that were thrown up against the antennas. And there had been previous attacks, not on that facility, but I knew there had been previous actions, small unit actions across Xinjiang.
When we come back, I'd like to know why. Why did those attacks take place? And of course, the larger question is, what do the Chinese do about it? That's Mike Sacharski, PEC International Pacific Enterprise Capital, here on ThinkTech Asia. We're talking about China's reaction to Middle East terrorism, and we are only setting the stage now for a more detailed discussion to come. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Mike Sacharski, Pacific Enterprise Capital, talking about China's reaction to Middle East terrorism. And in the break, he was telling me about what sounded like some real terrorist actions in Beijing already,
right,
by the Uyghurs.
Well, and it was attributed to the Uyghurs, and I don't know that they ever, actually found these people. What happened? It was about 1995, and it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the start of the rush hour, and 3 city buses on the busiest routes in Beijing blew up. And a number of people were killed, of course. Many were injured. A few years later, there was been a couple of bus bombings, but one that stands out in my mind was in Wuhan. Same situation, work hour, rush hour commuters bomb on the bus, and it blows up. And it was, you could almost see a pattern where the campaign was being brought home, brought to the homeland, so to speak. that it was no longer a peripheral, marginal campaign, way
out
out in Xinjiang province.
Xinjiang.
Right.
Now we're talking about
Right.
major cities.
Yeah. So there's been a running battle, if you will, between these elements and the government since the 30 years that I've been in China.
Wow,
so
that's so interesting.
so now we come to 9/11, and 9/11 then sets the stage for focusing on the Middle East. And I don't think anybody in China who's in the security forces or any of the government precincts, offices and so on, doesn't think that there will be a time when, after certain scores are settled in other areas, that the international fighters will turn to Xinjiang. And it's gone in a pattern, Chechnya and Bosnia and so forth, and in Afghanistan, and so they've kind of gone from one to another. I had a Chinese official, I might have told you this before, Jay, in an earlier program, but I was in an automobile with a Chinese official, works for one of the ministries. We're driving across town, and this was at the time this was like 2003, 2004, and we were fully engaged in Iraq. And he told me as we drove across town, he said, "Mike, when your war in Iraq is over, our war in Xinjiang begins."
Whoa.
And what upset that timetable was Syria. No one, at that time, no one thought that the next battleground was going to be Syria. Of course, it's still Iraq, but no one thought. So Syria has bought more time for China to get prepared for what they think will be an international support of someday, when the time comes,
interesting.
will be international support for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
But when you sort of create a pattern here, say that when ISIS, for example, gets the territory they want, melts all the borders, creates the Islamic State, then they'll be looking for new territory, moving east, so to speak.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, Jay, is I don't know that the Uyghurs are interested in being part of a caliphate. So that might pose they're most concerned about their homeland. And there hasn't been any indication that, they have this idea that they want to be part of a larger caliphate. They would like to be part of the Turkic, that Turkic band that runs across from Xinjiang, across Central Asia into Turkey.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that they want to be part of any caliphate that is behaving the way ISIS is behaving.
But it's a moving target. Who would have thought 2-3 years ago that we would have issues around caliphates?
Right.
Who would have thought that young kids coming from Britain and France and Germany and Spain, coming down into the Middle East with the idea of joining up ISIS and trying to create a caliphate? So it's a moving target. Maybe traditionally, the Uyghurs haven't been interested in that sort of thing. Maybe not so violent as some of the groups in the Middle East, but it's their young people that make the difference.
Yeah.
And maybe, ISIS is smart enough and cagey enough to get their young people recruited.
Bear in mind that China, from a geopolitical standpoint, China has 14 contiguous land borders with 14 different countries. We have 2, Canada and Mexico, so we get excited about how are we managing our 2 borders. China has 14, and among those 14, they have a common border with Afghanistan, and the way Afghanistan is shaped, there's this corridor that goes from Afghanistan right into China, south of Kashgar.
That's the Turkic band you were talking
and, well,
about.
it's also a corridor that can be used to support the Uyghurs.
Yes.
There's a common border with Pakistan, which isn't always secure because it's in one of the most rugged areas, the Pamir Knot, and you can't patrol that area. And then, of course, they've got common borders with Kyrgyzstan and other, meaning that there are a lot of entry points where international support can come into Xinjiang from international movements that would want to attach themselves next to the so-called freedom fighters in Xinjiang.
But it sounds like, just in the four corners of this discussion, that the Uyghurs themselves would not be so aggressive. They have attacked, and they have enjoyed some terrorism, have been terrorists to some extent, but they're not nearly like,
well, you know, yeah,
like ISIS is, for example.
Right. When I was in Xinjiang, maybe 2 or 3 times, and then of course we have Uyghurs in Beijing. Now, Uyghurs, by the way, I don't know about the last year or 2, but Uyghurs cannot travel freely from Xinjiang to, let's say, Beijing. They have to get permission, so to speak, go on trains that are designated for them. When they get to Beijing, they have to stay in hotels that only Uyghurs can stay at.
This is because the Chinese government is suspicious of them.
That's right. And so there's a control of the Uyghur movements, especially into Beijing.
How does the average Chinese person feel about them?
Well, I think, I can't speak for the average, but I'll speak for some of my friends. I think that, especially the gentleman that made the remark, when your war in Iraq ends, our war in Xinjiang begins. So I think a lot of people, the average, if you can say there's an average Mr. Wong, first of all, they're kind of caught up in their own daily lives, but there have been enough incidents now that they don't want disruption to the status quo. They know the turmoil. There's still enough that are old enough to remember the turmoil, the Cultural Revolution, and so on. And the last thing they want is anything that's going to upset the status quo.
Do they see the Uyghurs as a volatile force? In other words, a force that will, unless controlled, grow and be more aggressive?
Well, you know what's happened, Jay, and I've not been to Xinjiang in a while now, so I can't give you an eyewitness contrast between when I was there before and now. But there is an element of the Uyghur population that is now going to more traditional practice of Islam, including the wearing of burqas and the sort of outward appearances that you get with more traditional practice of Islam.
What happened?
And, well, I was just going to say, and in response to that, China has outlawed, forbidden the wearing of burqas and other symbols associated with more traditional kinds of Islam. So you wonder, and I don't have an answer, but you wonder what is driving that. What sort of thinking is driving that in a population that before dressed and looked much like they were in Turkey as much as they were in Xinjiang.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it reminds me of the French issue, where the women, you know, were wearing burqas, and the young girls, and the French government said, you can't wear that to school, and there was a big controversy about it. I'm not sure how it ended up, but there was a controversy about it.
Now, China has supported the U.S. In a lot of the initiatives, the anti-terrorist initiatives that the U.S. has sponsored. And there's now some question in China whether or not the sort of increasing clampdown that is being attributed to fighting terrorism is maybe going beyond the limits of fighting terrorism and impacting this average Mr. Wong that you were talking about a moment ago. So China's beginning to, as I think we've gone through that process to some extent in our country, they're beginning to go through that process as well. How much is enough or how much is too much when it comes to curtailing activities of the general population in the name of preventing terrorism?
Yeah. Is it a religious thing? I mean, this is a question I suppose you could ask wherever this happens in the world, but for the Uyghurs, is it a religious thing? Are they religious Muslims? Or are they just picking this up as
no, they've been practicing Muslims, practicing Sunni Muslims, but more from my experience and what I've seen, more secular, if you will, a more moderate or secular form of Islam.
Like you would see in Indonesia.
Well, yeah, Malaysia, yeah, and Turkey.
Yeah.
Since
right.
that's, you know, the origin. Yeah,
and,
exactly. Yeah.
So now the Chinese don't like dissent. The Chinese government doesn't like dissent. And it certainly doesn't like a group out of control. That's pretty threatening. Even the Falun Gong, which is not really all that threatening, becomes a threat. And then you have all this contention, violence, repression, whatnot. So why is that really necessary? What I'm asking is it really necessary for the Chinese government to repress the Uyghurs?
Well, I think I kind of want to go back to the broader implication of your question, and that is suppressing dissent. Remember that the Communist Party, 82 million, maybe 85 million now, they believe that they have the inalienable, inevitable mandate to rule China. And any activity, so as a result, they supervise everything. I've sort of flippantly said, but it's not too far off the actuality. You can't start a stamp club in China without getting approval, because they think that stamp clubs are that backdoor organization that somebody's going to infiltrate and use to try and threaten, weaken the party.
Oh, that's paranoid.
And it is, and I've experienced it myself. I think I might have shared with you, I was on a basketball team. I'm still officially a member of a basketball, all Chinese guys and me, and we played other teams of, like the Aeronautics Research Institute and that kind of stuff. We played frequently. We had to have a permit. We could not get a gym.
To play basketball?
Yeah, we could not book a gym unless we had our permit as an organization. So there is surveillance, there's control of everything. The last thing the party wants to allow to happen is some social group or some whatever group, for whatever reason, to be formed that they don't have control over. So you start with that, and then you extend it all the way across the range of issues that we're talking about to the Uyghurs. And you see where the intensity of their surveillance
must be much more intense,
is even greater.
Because this is closer to a real threat, especially if you accept that thing about how later on they'll be doing more.
You know, one of the greatest descriptions I've read of the Chinese Communist Party is a journalist who wrote a book on the party, and I'm not doing him justice because I read so many books on things that I get all the names mixed up. But he made the observation that there's only one other organization in the world that understands the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party understands that organization, and it's the Vatican. Because both organizations believe that they are true in their mission, that they have the sanctity, the blessing to carry out their mission. And for that reason, they understand each other's motivation, that's why they're the only country or the only diplomatic post that Beijing does not recommend or recognize is the Vatican. There are no diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Beijing.
Too threatening.
Because they see each other and they understand each other, and I believe it. They have the same personalities in their respective organizations, the same objectives, the same tactics, exactly the same. So you take that then and apply the mandate of heaven, if you will, the sense of mandate, and that's why there cannot be any activity that the party doesn't know about or sanction or supervise.
I want to explore that further in a hypothetical in a minute. That's Mike Sacharski, PEC International Pacific Enterprise Capital. This is ThinkTech Asia. We're talking about China's reaction to Middle East terrorism. We'll be right back for more.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I host a show called Healthcare in Hawaii here on ThinkTech. We get together once a week or sometimes twice a month. Depends. When we're busy, we get together less often, but we love to see you here to talk about the preeminent healthcare issues in our state. Our programs vary very widely. We talk about economics, we talk about healthcare, we talk about social issues on this program. Thanks for joining us.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're talking with Mike Sacharski of Pacific Enterprise Capital about China's reaction to Middle East terrorism. So, okay, so the Chinese government doesn't permit a lot of, dissent, and here we have something that has been already a bit of a threat. What did they do? What did the Chinese government do in the bus incident you described? Were they able to catch anybody? Did they take steps to respond?
Yeah, I don't recall, Jay, that they were able to apprehend anyone that was responsible for that. And so the response is more surveillance, of course, of buses and checking. You know, now, I was just in Beijing 4 weeks ago. And, excuse me, and all the subway stations are now like airport entrances and exits. And it used to be that for convenience sake, if you were a pedestrian, you could enter a subway station, because Beijing is so crowded, you could enter a subway station at one end and use it as an underground passage to get to the other end and continue your journey. Never get on the subway, but it was convenient. You can't do that anymore. Well, you can do it, but you have to stand in line to go through
security.
Through the security.
Yeah.
So as a result of the bus bombings, of course, they didn't have the electronics and security apparatus that they have today, but there's been a constant increasing application of security. Cameras, you know, they say London is the most has the most video coverage in the world. I think if, you know, you could go around Beijing, you might find that Beijing is there with London, maybe even more so.
So is it because of terrorism, or could it be,
Yes.
could it be that the Chinese government is using the prospect of terrorism as cover to increasing surveillance on everybody?
Oh, absolutely.
Everything?
Absolutely, yes, yes. It's kind of two delicious flavors, as the Chinese would say. They get double benefit.
Yeah.
And one when I say supports, one rationalizes the other. And so in the end, they can't lose on either situation.
Yeah.
And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier in the program, now it's getting to the point where citizens the average Mr. Wong is beginning to question, have we gone too far, and is it really that necessary?
So, okay. So repression is growing in general in China, would you say?
Control. I would say control.
Yeah. Now, where I want to go on this is to ask you, what would happen, knowing what we know, your experience there and so forth, what would happen if there were a real terrorist attack by the Uyghurs or by some extension of the Uyghurs in a major city in China? Which, I mean, it sounds like this is a possibility. This could happen.
Yeah.
If this happens, what would the Chinese government do now?
Yeah, well, they would, depending on where it happens, airport or railway station or hotel or whatever, that city would be immediately locked down, as would many other cities where they think, as they did for the Olympics. People don't realize. I was in Beijing, I was living there, and during the 2008 Olympics, we were virtually under what I consider martial law because the party did not want anything to go wrong that would face toward the public at such a time when the whole world was, focusing on Beijing.
I remember they even held information about the melamine.
Right.
Didn't reveal it because they didn't want to look bad.
Yeah. So they have a capability to lock things down. Of course, if you lock down the way and to the extent they would, now you're disrupting business flow and business patterns and so on. So there's a cost to locking things down too tightly and for too long. But they have the capability to do it. They have three levels of security. You have, of course, the PLA. Actually, you have four. You have the PLA. You have what's called the People's Armed Police, and they're called the People's Armed Police because they are. And so you start with the PLA, you've got the PAPs, the People's Armed Police, then you've got sort of your regular security, and then you've got a fourth, which is the Chungung, which are these municipal police forces. And then the infrastructure for the old neighborhood watch system is still, it's creaky in some of the big cities because of intense urbanization. But that system is still out there. And so you've got 5 or 6 levels of clampdown, if you will, that can be used in a serious event. And I would, just to go back and assure our listeners that I think by and large, there are many Uyghurs that are trying to, live within the system and so forth. But there are also a number of Uyghurs who don't see any hope, don't see any future, and they're resisting, in some cases, I think, Jay, as much against that as they are with any sense that, they would like to see more of a look west rather than a look east. So everything in China is complicated. Yeah. Nothing's simple.
Well,
and so they're embedded in this, in these issues are the economic issues, the social issues, and so forth.
All connected.
Yeah.
A few months ago, we saw China being really, I thought, very smart, very strategic in dealing with the street protests in Hong Kong. They never pushed it to the point where it was going to be a problem for them, either in Hong Kong or, in mainland China. I thought it was skillful. You to apply the pressure, you relieve the pressure. You don't necessarily, you avoid having, a big problem. And I wonder if that same kind of process would be appropriate here. So you take the temperature of the average Mr. Wang, you see if he's excited about this, what appears to be a terroristic attack, and if he is, then you feel you can do more without getting pushback from the people. If he isn't, then maybe you're going to withhold. You're not going to go the full distance in terms of responding to the terrorism. I mean, I think the Chinese government is very sophisticated in how much repression they use, in order to avoid having a conflagration.
Right. I think you're right. I think it was a good blend, if you will, of sophistication and brute power. Done very well. So the brute power didn't look so brute. And
talk about Hong Kong.
Hong Kong, and the sophistication was in many cases very subtle. One of the main levers, if you will, of influence in that situation was that many of the large companies that have major offices domiciled in Hong Kong came under tremendous pressure from Beijing to, within their companies, make sure that people came to work, especially young people.
Call their workers back.
Yeah, exactly.
Get them off the street.
Yeah, right, and so forth. And there were companies that understood, and they wanted to get on with business. They didn't want, to be disrupted. And there was the sort of the rebuffing of the petition system, in that the students, or the Democrats, which were a lot of students, they had a petition, and they wanted to go to Beijing and present it, and they were told by a senior official, that's unrealistic. You can't. Nobody can just go to Beijing and present something to Xi Jinping, because they wanted to give it to Xi Jinping. And the official explained, these decisions were made like 2 and 3 years ago that they were objecting to, and they were enshrined by the People's Congress, so there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. So don't waste your time trying to. So it was a combination of subtlety and nuance, as well as just saying, no way, you're not going to be allowed to do it.
Futile,
but you're right. It was a very effective way of eventually diffusing that situation.
One last point, Mike, and that is, the Chinese, as we have discussed, they're good at applying pressure, taking the pressure off, and they have been arguably successful at dealing with the prospect of terrorism. I suggest there might be more of it if they hadn't been so skillful in dealing with it when they found it. What can we learn from the Chinese government on dealing with terrorism in this country? What can they learn from the Chinese government in dealing with terrorism in Europe?
Well, I think, first of all, our terrorism approach tends to get politicized. And when you are the Vatican, or you are the equivalent of the Vatican, you're concerned about public relations and so on. But in terms of, the back room, there's not there's certainly dissent within the party, but there isn't the kind of political attack. For example, in the U.S., an official will announce an approach or a policy to terrorism, and immediately you got all these attack dogs that come out of wherever they come out of, and you don't have that in China. So the one advantage they have is that they don't have to explain themselves like we do. And so therefore they can concentrate more energy and force at the point of attack, if you will, than we can. And so I think that's one advantage they have, and one thing that we could learn. We tend to tell everybody, as soon as we decide what we're going to do, tell them all what we're doing. And there's certainly an element of transparency that is needed, but we also, I think, open ourselves up to seeing those policies, and again, they're announced usually for political reasons. There's an election coming up, or some reason that you can tie to to the policy for terrorism. So I think that's the biggest advantage that China has, and maybe something we could learn, that we've got to put terrorism on get it out of the political arena and get it into the national arena in terms of a national concern, not a political football.
Yeah, yeah. Amen to that, Mike. I mean, it seems to me that we have more now than we had before, and it's happening in more places than it happened before. More countries, more borders, boundaries, more national governments are threatened than before, including even the Chinese.
Yeah.
So.
Well, remember, we only have 2 borders. They have 14.
Right.
So
I would be concerned if I were them.
So when we look at our 2 borders, think of all the comment and controversy that comes out of the woodwork about our borders from all quarters.
Yeah.
And imagine if we had 14 borders.
Yeah. Mike Sacharski, Pacific Enterprise Capital International, here on ThinkTech Asia, talking about China's reaction to Middle Eastern terrorism. Thank you so much, Mike.
Well, thank you, Jay. Enjoyed it.
Same here.
Okay.
Aloha.